A duke who enters his own house through the servant's door has either lost his kingdom or come to learn who has been ruling it in his name. By the time the rain reached Whitmore Hall, it had already turned the long carriage road into black glass and beaten the winter ivy flat against the stone walls. The house stood at the top of the hill like a judgment that had waited too many years to be spoken, its windows burning with narrow strips of candlelight, its chimneys breathing into the cold Maryland night. No herald rode ahead. No footman ran to open the great iron gates. No bell rang to announce the return of Duke Nathaniel Whitmore. He had forbidden all of it. He came alone, in a plain wool coat darkened by rain, with mud on the hem of his trousers and a servant's cap pulled low enough to hide the sharpness of his eyes. In the pocket near his heart, beneath the rough cloth, rested the black signet ring of House Whitmore, wrapped in a handkerchief so no one would see it by accident. For 8 months, letters from the estate had reached him in Boston with polite lies folded into every line. The accounts were sound, they said. The staff was loyal. The tenants were grateful. The household ran in perfect order. Yet 3 maids had disappeared without wages, 2 stable boys had written to him in fear and then gone silent, and his late wife's name, once spoken here with reverence, had become something people whispered as if it were a stain on the walls. Nathaniel had buried his grief under duty for so long that the world believed he had no heart left to wound. Perhaps the world was right. Perhaps whatever had once lived in him had died with Eleanor Whitmore in the locked East Chamber 5 winters ago. But a dead heart could still hear dishonor. A dead heart could still recognize rot. So he had returned not as master, not as judge, not as the cold nobleman whose portrait glared from the gallery, but as Thomas Gray, a new under-servant sent from a distant recommendation no one would bother to verify before morning. At the servant's entrance, an old kitchen boy opened the door just wide enough to study him through the steam of boiled potatoes and damp coal smoke. "You're the new man?" the boy asked. Nathaniel lowered his voice. "Thomas Gray, sent for cellar work and general service." The boy looked him over, saw only wet boots, rough gloves, and a man too tired to be important. That was the first useful truth of the night. People revealed themselves most carelessly before those they believed had no power. Inside, the air smelled of ash, brass polish, stale bread, and fear carefully swept beneath the rugs. Whitmore Hall had once been severe but dignified, all dark oak, white marble, and long corridors where candlelight moved like quiet prayer. Now the servants' passage was colder than the yard, and the walls seemed to hold their breath. Nathaniel followed the boy past shelves of folded linens, past a cracked mirror, past a row of bells marked with rooms he knew better than his own memories. The bell for the east wing was tied with a strip of black ribbon. No one had removed it since Eleanor's death. No one, it seemed, had dared touch it. Near the pantry door, 2 maids stopped talking the instant he approached. One carried a tray with only a heel of bread and a cup of thin broth. "Who was that for?" Nathaniel asked before he could stop himself. The taller maid gave a short laugh. "For the new girl, if Mrs. Crane remembers she exists. Clara Bennett." The other whispered, glancing down the hall as though the name itself might call punishment. "Poor thing." The taller maid's mouth tightened, not with pity, but with the exhausted relief of someone grateful not to be the one suffering tonight. "May God help the girl. No one survives the East Wing for long." Nathaniel's eyes moved to the tray, then to the black ribbon on the bell, then to the corridor beyond them where the stone floor faded into darkness. The house gave a low groan as wind pressed against its seams. Somewhere above, a door closed softly, not with force, but with finality. He had come to uncover theft, forged ledgers, and betrayal. He had expected cowardice, greed, perhaps even cruelty. But he had not expected that the first name to trouble the silence of his house would belong to a girl given bread fit for the fire and sent into the coldest wing like an offering no one intended to remember. "Where is she now?" he asked. The maids looked at him strangely, as if concern were an accent foreign to this place. Then the younger one nodded toward the narrow servants' stairs. "Up there, scrubbing the marble outside her Grace's old room." For the first time that night, Nathaniel forgot the rain on his shoulders and the disguise on his back. Her Grace, not the dead duchess, not the scandal, not the woman whose memory had been dragged through drawing rooms by mouths too comfortable with lies. Her Grace. The word struck something buried so deep in him that he almost reached for the ring in his pocket. Instead, he took the tray from the maid's hands. I'll carry it, he said. You, she asked. I have 2 hands. He turned before either of them could answer and climbed toward the east wing, each step drawing him closer to the part of his house he had not entered since the funeral. The candles grew fewer. The air sharpened. At the top of the stairs, beneath a window glazed with rain, he saw her, a young woman in a faded gray dress, kneeling on the marble with a brush in one hand, her pale hair pinned badly at the nape of her neck, loose strands damp against her cheek. Her hands were reddened from cold water, yet her back remained straight. Not proud in the way nobles were proud, with jewels and witnesses, but quietly, as if some private dignity inside her had refused to bow no matter how hard the world pressed down. She did not hear him at first. She was looking at the locked door of Eleanor's chamber. Then, in a voice so soft it barely crossed the hall, Clara Bennet whispered, "Forgive them, Your Grace. They do not know what kindness costs." Nathaniel stopped in the shadows, the tray steady in his hands, while the rain beat against the glass like 1,000 small warnings. Nathaniel did not step forward at once. Men of his rank were taught from boyhood that hesitation was weakness, that command must arrive before feeling, that a house answered best to a voice sharpened by certainty. Yet there, in the dim east corridor of Whitmore Hall, with rain trembling against the high windows and a tray of poor supper cooling in his hands, he found himself held still by a servant girl's whisper. Clara Bennet remained on her knees before the locked chamber, unaware that the master of the house stood only a few yards behind her in a borrowed coat. She dipped the brush into a wooden pail, wrung it once with fingers reddened by cold, and returned to the marble as though the floor had offended someone powerful enough to demand repentance. The water was gray. The rag beside her was thin. A small candle burned near her elbow, its flame leaning whenever the wind searched beneath the old door. She could not have been more than 22, perhaps 23, with a face too pale from long hours indoors and a quietness that did not belong to peace. It belonged to endurance. Nathaniel had seen women of Boston society lower their eyes to pretend modesty and lift them to measure wealth. Clara's eyes, when she finally sensed him and looked over her shoulder, measured nothing. They only prepared for blame. "I am sorry," she said quickly, rising halfway before remembering the brush in her hand. "I did not know anyone else was assigned to this hall tonight." He held out the tray. "Someone forgot your supper." For a moment, she stared at it as if food delivered without insult must be a trick. Then she stood fully, smoothing her faded gray dress with damp palms. "Thank you, Mr. Gray." The name struck him strangely from her mouth, simple and false, yet safer than his own. "You know who I am?" he asked. The kitchen boy said a new servant had come through the back door. "Mrs. Crane said you would not last a week if you had opinions." A faint breath of humor touched her voice, then vanished before it could become warmth. Nathaniel set the tray on the window ledge. "Does Mrs. Crane often measure people by how little they speak?" Clara glanced toward the servant's stairs. Fear moved across her face like the shadow of a passing cloud, but she did not answer fear with complaint. "Mrs. Crane believes a silent house is an orderly one. And you agree?" "I believe silence is sometimes the only blanket given to those who are cold." He had heard clever sentences in marble rooms, speeches polished until they shone, compliments shaped like knives and prayers shaped like bargains. None had entered him as that sentence did. He looked at her hands. The knuckles were chapped, the nails clean but worn short, and there was a narrow strip of white cloth tied around one finger where the cold water had split the skin. No dramatics, no plea, just the evidence of a life required to suffer neatly. "Why are you working here with no fire?" he asked. Clara lowered her gaze, not in shame, but in caution. "The east wing is not to be warmed unless guests are placed here." "There are no guests." "No." She looked at the locked door. "Only memory." Nathaniel's breath changed before he could command it back. Memory. In this corridor, the word had weight. Eleanor's chamber had been sealed 5 years earlier after the funeral, and he had ordered no one to enter. Not because he wished to preserve it, as the household had assumed, but because he could not bear the thought of finding her ribbon on a chair, her books beside the bed, her scent gone from the curtains. Yet the marble before the door was spotless. The brass handle shone. The portrait lamp across the hall had been trimmed with care. Someone had been tending the edges of grief he himself had abandoned. "Who told you to clean here?" he asked. "No one." Clara's answer was almost too soft. "Then why do it?" She lifted the cup of broth from the tray, but did not drink. Her eyes remained on the door, as if the dead might hear better than the living. "Because dust is unkind to the forgotten." Nathaniel turned his face slightly toward the window, letting the darkness hide whatever had passed across it. The rain made the glass look like black water. Behind him, Clara took a careful sip of broth, the gesture so restrained that he understood she had learned not to appear hungry even when hunger had been assigned to her. "You speak of her grace with respect," he said. Clara grew still. In the language of Whitmore Hall, that sentence was dangerous. Respect for Eleanor had apparently become rebellion. "She was good to my mother once," Clara said. "Before I came here. Before any of them knew my name." A kindness from a duchess is not usually remembered by servants. It is by the servant who needed it. Nathaniel looked back at her. The candlelight caught the loose strands of her pale hair and made them silver at the edges. She seemed small in that high corridor, surrounded by locked doors and old stone, yet something in her refused to be diminished by it. "And for that, you work in the cold?" he asked. "For that, I do not let them make her cruel in death when she was merciful in life." The words fell quietly, without challenge, without performance. That made them worse. That made them true. Before Nathaniel could speak, a bell rang below, sharp and impatient. Clara flinched so slightly that only a man trained by grief would have seen it. She placed the cup back on the tray, though she had barely tasted it. "Mrs. Crane will be calling. You have not eaten. Then I shall be quicker tomorrow." She bent to lift the pail, but Nathaniel reached it first. "I will carry it." Her eyes widened. "That is not necessary. Few decent things are." For one fragile second, Clara Bennet looked at him not as another servant, not as a stranger, not as a man beneath her or above her, but as if kindness itself had entered the corridor wearing a face she did not yet trust. Then footsteps sounded from the stairwell, hard and clipped, and her expression closed like a candle pinched between fingers. Nathaniel turned toward the sound with the pail in his hand and his false name on his back, while the ring of House Whitmore rested hidden against his heart, growing heavier with every breath. Mrs. Beatrice Crane appeared at the top of the servants' stairs with a ring of keys at her waist and a candle held as straight as a sentence of judgment. She was a tall woman in a black dress polished by years of authority, with silver-threaded hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull all softness from her face. Her eyes passed over Nathaniel first and found no importance there. That, too, he stored away. Then her gaze settled on Clara, and the air changed. "Miss Bennet," she said, each syllable neat and cold. "When a bell is rung in this house, it is not a suggestion." Clara folded her hands before her apron. "Yes, Mrs. Crane. I was just finishing the East Corridor." The East Corridor did not require conversation. Nathaniel felt the pale handle press into his palm. He had commanded soldiers, bankers, stewards, and judges with less effort than it took to remain silent under that woman's tone. Clara did not defend herself. She only lowered her eyes enough to survive the moment. "The new man brought my supper," she said. "I did not ask him to stay." Mrs. Crane turned her candle toward Nathaniel. "Thomas Gray, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." The word tasted like ash, but he gave it plainly. "You were hired for cellar work, not for idling in forbidden corridors." "I did not know this corridor was forbidden. Ignorance is a poor blanket in winter." Her mouth curved with satisfaction at her own cruelty. "Remember that, and you may last until Sunday." Clara reached for the pail, but Nathaniel did not release it at once. Only when her fingers brushed the rim did he let go, not because Mrs. Crane ordered silence, but because Clara's brief glance asked him not to make trouble she would be forced to pay for later. That glance taught him more than the estate ledgers ever had. Fear lived here with a schedule. Kindness was counted as debt. Mrs. Crane sent Clara below to polish the silver in the breakfast room, though midnight had nearly passed. Nathaniel was ordered to carry coal to the lower pantry, then return to the kitchen for inspection. He obeyed with the careful slowness of a man walking through his own house, as though it were enemy ground. The servant passages bent behind walls he had never noticed as master. Narrow staircases turned like secrets. Doors opened into rooms where heat never reached, where old coats hung beside cracked boots, where the people who kept Whitmore Hall breathing slept six to a chamber and spoke only when footsteps faded. By the pantry, he found Clara kneeling beside a crate of tarnished silver, a cloth in her hand, her untouched bread still wrapped in linen beside her. The broth had gone cold. She did not complain. She worked as if hunger were merely another candle to be managed before it burned out. "You should eat," he said, low enough that the walls could not carry it far. She did not look up. "If Mrs. Crane sees food near the silver, she will say I stained the linen. Then I will stand between you and the door." "You are new," Clara said. "That is why you believe doors protect people." The answer left no bitterness behind it, only knowledge. Nathaniel crouched near the crate, taking up a spoon blackened at the edges. "Then teach me the rules of this house." Her cloth slowed. "Why?" "Because I dislike failing at my position." At that, a faint smile touched her face, so brief that it might have been candlelight shifting. "Rule 1. Do not be seen helping me. Rule 2. Do not ask why. Rule 3. If Lord Vincent visits, do not repeat anything you hear, unless you wish it to become your fault by morning." The name moved through Nathaniel like a wire drawn tight. Vincent Blackwell, his cousin, his nearest male relation, a man who wrote affectionate letters in smooth ink and spoke often of loyalty. "He visits the servants' hall?" Nathaniel asked. Clara wrapped the spoon carefully in the cloth. "He visits wherever people are too poor to contradict him." Before Nathaniel could press further, voices sounded beyond the half-open pantry door. Mrs. Crane's clipped tone came first. Then another, lower and refined, carrying the lazy confidence of a gentleman who had never doubted that walls would keep his secrets. Nathaniel rose without sound. Clara's eyes widened. She shook her head once, pleading without words for him to stay still, but he moved into the narrow shadow behind the shelves, where sacks of flour and barrels of apples hid him from the corridor. Lord Vincent Blackwell stepped into view wearing a dark traveling coat, rain on his shoulders, and impatience in every line of his handsome face. Mrs. Crane stood beside him with her keys clenched in one hand. "You said the Duke would not return before spring," she whispered. "He will not," Vincent replied. "Nathaniel despises this house. He despises memory more. Boston suits him because no one there says Eleanor's name." Nathaniel's hand closed around the shelf. Clara had gone still beside the silver crate, pale as the candle wax. Mrs. Crane lowered her voice. "The girl has been near the chamber again." "Clara Bennet?" Vincent asked. "She cleans where no one sends her. She asks nothing, which makes her more troublesome than a thief. A thief wants gain. That one wants truth." Vincent's silence lasted only a breath, but it chilled the pantry more than the winter draft. "Then make her look like a thief." Mrs. Crane did not answer at once. "The Monroe diamonds arrive tomorrow for the winter ball." "Not the diamonds," Vincent said smoothly. "Something smaller. Something sentimental. Something the household will believe a hungry girl might take." Clara's face did not break. That was what struck Nathaniel most. She heard them arranging her ruin, and still she did not gasp, did not cry out, did not beg the darkness for mercy. She simply folded both hands around the tarnished spoon until her knuckles whitened. Vincent continued, almost bored. "Once she is dismissed, search her room. If she found anything Eleanor left behind, I want it before Nathaniel ever sets foot in Maryland again." Nathaniel stood in the shadows wearing a servant's coat, while the lie of his own absence protected the guilty. Across the pantry, Clara slowly lifted her eyes, and for one terrible instant, she seemed not frightened for herself, but for the name of a dead woman no one else had defended. The candle near the door trembled. Then Lord Vincent said the words Nathaniel would carry like ice beneath his ribs. "The dead cannot speak, Beatrice. That is why the living must decide what they meant." Lord Vincent and Mrs. Crane left the pantry with their candle between them, and the darkness they abandoned seemed larger than before. For several seconds, neither Nathaniel nor Clara moved. The house settled around them with faint wooden sighs, the kind old walls made when winter pressed close and secrets had nowhere warm to hide. Clara was the first to breathe. She lowered the tarnished spoon into the crate with such care that it made no sound at all, then folded the cloth over it, as if silver still mattered after hearing her own downfall arranged like a household chore. Nathaniel stepped from behind the flour sacks, his servant's coat rough against his shoulders, his pulse beating with a discipline that almost hurt. He had come seeking proof of theft, perhaps mismanagement, perhaps family ambition turned ugly in the dark. He had not expected to stand within 20 feet of his cousin and hear Eleanor's name used like a locked box to be buried again. Clara looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same question she did not dare ask aloud. How much had he heard? Enough, he wanted to say. Enough to bring the ceiling down upon them. Enough to make every bell in Whitmore Hall ring until the guilty learned the sound of fear. But Thomas Gray could not speak like Duke Nathaniel Whitmore. Not yet. Not while Vincent still believed him absent. Not while whatever Eleanor had left behind remained hidden. You should go to your room, Clara whispered. If they find you here, they will say you listened because I told you to. And if they find you here, they already know where to find me. The answer was quiet, but it carried the weary precision of someone who had learned the shape of injustice by living inside it. Nathaniel studied her face in the candlelight. She was pale, but not broken. Frightened, but not surrendered. There was a difference, and it humbled him more than he wished to admit. What did Lord Vincent mean, he asked, when he spoke of something her grace left behind? Clara turned toward the pantry door. That question is not safe. Few true questions are. Then leave it unasked. She gathered the linen around her untouched bread and tucked it into her apron pocket. Not to eat, he realized, but to save for morning. The small economy of hunger tightened something beneath his ribs. Miss Bennet, he said, more gently than he had intended. They mean to accuse you. I know. They mean to search your room. I know. And still you are calm. Clara's mouth trembled once, not with weakness, but with the effort of refusing to let fear become visible for anyone who might use it. Calm is what poor people are called when they have no chair to collapse into. Nathaniel looked away. The candle near the pantry latch bent in a draught, throwing her shadow long across the stone floor. It touched his boots and seemed, impossibly, to accuse him. This was his house. These were his corridors. This was his silence, grown large enough for cruel people to shelter inside it. Tell me what you know, he said. Clara shook her head. You are a new servant. You should not spend your first night trying to become a dismissed one. Perhaps I dislike the way this house treats its servants. Then you will be very unhappy here. She lifted the crate of silver with both hands, but it was too heavy. Nathaniel reached for it, and this time she did not stop him. Together they carried it to the side table beneath the shelves, close enough that their hands nearly touched over the rim. Clara withdrew first, not from offense, but from habit. Her grace once came to the village in January, she said at last, so softly that the words seemed meant more for the dust than for him. My mother was a seamstress then. She had missed rent after fever kept her from working. The landlord meant to put us out before a storm. Her grace heard of it while passing through and paid 6 months in advance. She said no child should learn the sound of a door closing against her in winter. Nathaniel could see Eleanor as Clara spoke, not the portrait version, not the scandalous ghost Vincent had helped invent, but the woman who used to hide coins in prayer books for widows too proud to accept charity. He had forgotten that part of her because grief had taught him to remember only the wound. Your mother told you this? He asked. My mother kept the note her grace sent with the money. She read it every Christmas Eve until she died. Clara paused, and the candle painted a faint gold line along her cheek. When I came here for work, I thought serving her grace's house would be a way of honoring that kindness. But by then, everyone spoke of her as though kindness had been the lie. And you believed otherwise. I had proof otherwise. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. Clara seemed to realize what she had said, and her fingers closed around the edge of her apron. From within it, beneath the saved bread and folded linen, she drew a small handkerchief. It was old, carefully washed, and embroidered in pale blue thread with Eleanor Whitmore's initials. I found this behind the loose panel near her chamber, Clara whispered. It was wrapped around a piece of sealing wax. There was an impression in it. Not the Duke's seal. Not her grace's. She looked toward the ceiling, as if footsteps might gather there by magic. Lord Vincent's. Nathaniel did not reach for the handkerchief. He could not. His hand might have betrayed him. Instead, he stared at those blue initials while the past shifted under his feet like ice beginning to crack. Clara folded the cloth again with reverence and held it close. If they find this, they will burn it and say I stole it. Why keep it? His voice was nearly gone. Clara raised her eyes to his, and for the first time that night, the quiet girl in the gray dress looked almost fierce. Because the dead cannot speak, Mr. Gray. But that does not mean the living are allowed to lie for them. Clara hid the handkerchief before the candle could betray its embroidery to anyone beyond the pantry shadows. The movement was small, but Nathaniel saw the reverence in it, as if the faded cloth were not evidence, but a fragile grave marker placed in her keeping. A wiser man would have stepped away then. A colder man would have taken the proof, revealed his name, and ended the game before dawn. But Nathaniel had learned that sudden justice, when brought into a house built on lies, often sent the guilty running with the truth clenched in their fists. Vincent still believed him absent. Mrs. Crane still believed Thomas Gray was only another poor man with a back to bend and a mouth to close. For one more night, that belief was useful. "Do not keep it in your room," he said. Clara looked toward the servants' stairs. "I do not." "Then where?" She studied him with a quiet severity that did not belong to a maid speaking to a new servant. It belonged to a person who had lost too much to trust easily. "You ask questions like a man accustomed to answers." Nathaniel almost smiled, but the house was too cold for it. "And you answer like a woman accustomed to danger." "Danger answers whether I speak or not." The bell rang again below, this time from the breakfast room, sharp enough to make the candle tremble. Clara reached for the silver cloth, but Nathaniel took it first and began polishing a fork with deliberate care. "Eat," he said. "I will finish these. Mrs. Crane will know. Then Mrs. Crane will discover I am poor at following bells." Clara's eyes widened with something close to alarm. "Mr. Gray, this house punishes kindness by calling it disobedience. Then let it call me disobedient." For a moment, she simply looked at him. No one had offered her protection here without first naming its price. That knowledge stood between them as plainly as the crate of silver. At last, she took the bread from her pocket, broke off the smallest piece, and ate as if even hunger required permission. Nathaniel lowered his gaze to the fork in his hand. He had dined in rooms where 20 candles burned for one table and silver covers were lifted over food no one finished. He had sat beside governors, judges, and widowed heiresses who spoke of poverty as if it were weather happening in another county. Yet here was Clara Bennet, saving half a crust for mourning in the house that bore his name. Shame did not strike him loudly. It settled, cold and precise, beneath his ribs. "Why did you stay after your mother died?" he asked. Clara wrapped the remaining bread carefully. "Because the church charity was full, because the seamstress who promised me work fell ill, because a girl with no father and no fortune does not move through the world so much as she is moved by it." "No one helped you?" "Some tried." Her voice remained even. "But help is heavy when the giver wants gratitude to last longer than the bread." Nathaniel stopped polishing. The sentence entered him like a door opening onto a darker room. Clara must have sensed the change in him, because she looked away quickly. "Forgive me. I speak too freely when I am tired." "No," he said. "You speak truthfully." The word truthfully seemed to trouble her more than insult would have. She gathered another spoon and dipped the cloth into polish. Truth is not much use to a servant unless someone powerful finds it convenient. Perhaps someone will. Powerful people prefer silence. It makes every room more comfortable for them. Nathaniel had no defense against that. He had preferred silence. After Eleanor's death, he had sealed her chamber, dismissed questions, ignored letters from old tenants who hinted that matters in Maryland were not as they seemed. He had called it grief. Perhaps it had also been cowardice wearing mourning clothes. A sound rose from the hall, not footsteps this time, but a soft scrape, then a whisper. Clara went still. Nathaniel set the fork down without a clink. Through the pantry gap, he saw a young maid pass by carrying folded napkins. Her face turned pale with curiosity and fear. Behind her, Mrs. Crane's shadow stretched long across the wall. The housekeeper did not enter. She paused just beyond sight, listening. Nathaniel knew the art of a waiting enemy. He lifted his voice before Clara could panic. "I told you, Miss Bennet, the cellar inventory was marked wrong. 12 sacks of flour, not 10. Clara understood at once, though her hands remained tense. "Then you should report it in the morning." "I will, if I am still employed." "That depends on whether you learn not to count what you are not asked to count." Mrs. Crane's shadow lingered, then withdrew. Only when the corridor emptied did Clara let out the breath she had been holding. "You lied easily," she whispered. "I have spent years listening to better liars." That is not a comforting answer. It was not meant to be. The faintest warmth touched her mouth again, and Nathaniel felt the strange, dangerous ache of wanting to see it remain. Not admiration alone, not pity, something quieter, and therefore more perilous. Clara Bennet did not know she had become the first honest thing in Whitmore Hall since Eleanor died. She only returned to her silver, shoulders straight, hair loose at her cheek, the hidden handkerchief resting somewhere close to her heart. "Thomas," she said after a long silence, using his false name with a trust that hurt him. "Have you ever lost someone so completely that people began telling you who they had been, and you almost believed them?" Nathaniel's hand closed around the cloth. Outside, rain slid down the pantry window like black thread. "Yes," he said, "I lost someone. Then I lost the man who remembered her rightly." Clara did not offer comfort too quickly. That was her mercy. She only moved the candle closer between them, so its small gold circle touched both their hands on the table. "Then perhaps," she said, "you know why I cannot let them bury her grace twice." Nathaniel looked at the flame, at the silver, at the girl who guarded a dead woman's name with nothing but a handkerchief and a starving heart, and something inside him broke without sound. Not enough for tears, not enough for confession, only enough for the old ice to split. Below them, the house prepared for mourning, and for the winter ball that would bring silk, diamonds, and false smiles through the front doors. Above them, the east wing waited with its locked chamber and its silent dead. Nathaniel remained Thomas Gray for one more night, but in the pocket near his heart, the black ring of Whitmore seemed to burn through its linen wrapping. By noon, Whitmore Hall had begun to dress itself in splendor, as if silk and candlelight could persuade the world that no sorrow had ever crossed its threshold. Footmen carried garlands of winter pine through the main corridor, their needles scattering dark green flecks across the white marble. Maids polished banisters until the carved oak shone like still water. In the ballroom, 32 candles were set into the great chandelier, and every mirror was rubbed clean enough to multiply the lies that would soon smile before them. Outside, the rain had ended, leaving the Maryland hills wrapped in a pale mist, and a thin frost silvered the carriage road where guests would arrive after sunset. Nathaniel moved among the servants with cold dust on his cuffs and his cap low over his brow, carrying trays, lifting crates, and hearing more truth in one morning as Thomas Gray than he had heard in 5 years as Duke Whitmore. Mrs. Crane ruled the household with a quiet terror disguised as efficiency. Lord Vincent arrived before the guests and moved through the rooms as if measuring what he expected to inherit. Miss Abigail Monroe came with her mother in a carriage painted cream and gold, her laughter bright enough to scrape the air, her gloved hand resting often on the diamond pendant at her throat. Everyone spoke of Nathaniel's absence. Everyone assumed his grief had made him distant, his distance had made him weak, and his weakness had left the house ready for other hands. Nathaniel listened, and the black ring hidden in his pocket seemed heavier each hour. Clara worked from room to room without lifting her voice. She carried folded linen to the guest chambers, arranged candles in the west parlor, and replaced cracked china before Mrs. Crane could accuse her of negligence. Twice, Nathaniel found small ways to stand near her without seeming to. He took the heavier tray from her hands when no one watched. He left a cup of hot tea behind a curtain in the servants' alcove. He placed a fresh pair of wool gloves where she would find them beside the laundry basket. Each kindness troubled her more than cruelty did. Cruelty had rules. Kindness from a stranger had no shape she could trust. Late in the afternoon, as the sky turned the color of old pewter, Clara found him in the lower passage beside the wine cellar. She held the gloves in both hands. "These are yours," she said. "No, then whose are they?" "Yours, if you are sensible." She looked down at them, then back at him. "Mr. Gray, you must not do this. Offer gloves. Offer proof that I am not alone. That is the sort of thing Mrs. Crane notices." Nathaniel leaned one shoulder against the cold stone wall, careful to keep his face in shadow. "And what does Mrs. Crane do with what she notices?" Clara's expression tightened. "She gives it a name that can be punished." Before he could answer, the ballroom bell rang 3 times, calling servants to final positions. Clara folded the gloves and pushed them back into his hands. Her fingers touched his only for a breath. They were cold. Then she turned away, straight-backed and silent, walking toward a room that had already been prepared to condemn her. The winter ball began at 8. Carriages arrived in a glittering procession, wheels crunching over frost, lanterns swinging like captive stars. Guests entered in velvet, satin, black coats, pearl combs, and white gloves, bringing with them the scent of cold air and expensive perfume. Music rose from the ballroom, elegant and hollow. Nathaniel stood near the service wall with a tray of crystal glasses, watching his own world perform itself. Miss Abigail moved from guest to guest like a candle pleased with its reflection, speaking of charity, refinement, and the tragedy of poor Duke Whitmore, absent in his grief. Vincent remained near the fireplace, smiling only when he believed no honest person watched him. Mrs. Crane stood at the edge of the room, her keys hidden beneath black silk, her eyes following Clara. The trap came after the first dance. Abigail touched her throat with a graceful cry and announced that her pendant was missing. Conversation folded inward at once. A dozen guests looked toward the floor, toward tables, toward one another's hands. Mrs. Crane stepped forward too quickly, too prepared. "No one leaves the ballroom," she declared. "Every servant will be searched according to household order." Nathaniel felt the room narrow. Clara stood beside the sideboard, holding a tray of empty cups. Her face went pale, but she did not move. One by one, the servants were called forward. Pockets were turned, aprons checked, boxes opened. The performance was tidy, polite, and cruel in the way only respectable rooms could be cruel. When Mrs. Crane reached Clara, her voice softened for the guests. "Miss Bennet, you understand the necessity." Clara set down the tray. "Yes, Mrs. Crane." "Your apron." Clara untied it with steady hands. "Nothing." "Your sleeves." "Nothing." Then Mrs. Crane turned to a small drawer beneath the sideboard where extra napkins were kept. She opened it as though guided by duty, reached beneath the folded linen, and drew out Abigail Monroe's diamond pendant. A murmur passed through the ballroom, soft and hungry. Abigail pressed a hand to her heart. Vincent lowered his eyes to hide his satisfaction. Mrs. Crane held the pendant up to the chandelier light. "Miss Bennet," she said, with sorrow so false it seemed almost polished, "have you anything to say?" Clara looked at the diamonds, then at the faces waiting for her shame to entertain them. Her hands remained at her sides. "I did not take it." The words were quiet. No one believed quietness when spectacle had been offered instead. A gentleman near the fireplace muttered that hunger made thieves of pretty girls. Another voice said poor breeding always revealed itself. Nathaniel's grip tightened around the tray until the crystal trembled. Clara heard them. He knew she heard them because her chin lifted a fraction, not in pride, but in refusal to let their words decide the height of her soul. Mrs. Crane stepped closer. "Then perhaps you will kneel and ask Miss Monroe for mercy." The music had stopped. The house held its breath. Nathaniel saw Clara look once toward the east wing corridor, where Eleanor's chamber waited in darkness, where the hidden handkerchief guarded a truth more valuable than diamonds. Clara understood the bargain being offered. Kneel and be branded guilty. Refuse and be destroyed louder. Slowly, she drew in a breath. Nathaniel set the tray down without a sound. He could not reveal himself yet. Not while Vincent still held the deeper secret. Not before the proof was safe. But neither could he remain only shadow. As Clara lowered her eyes, not yet kneeling, not yet broken, Nathaniel stepped from the servants' line and placed himself between her and the glittering circle that had gathered to watch her fall. Nathaniel did not move quickly. That was what made the ballroom fall silent. A guilty man rushes. A frightened man stumbles. But the servant who stepped between Clara Bennet and the circle of candlelit judgment moved with the calm of someone who had spent his life expecting rooms to make way for him. At first, no one understood the danger of it. To them, he was still Thomas Gray, the new man from the lower passages, a pair of rough gloves, a plain coat, a face half-shadowed by service and rain. Mrs. Crane stared at him with offended disbelief, as if a chair had spoken out of turn. Miss Abigail Monroe lowered her hand from her throat, her diamonds found, and her tears no longer necessary. Lord Vincent, near the fireplace, watched with narrowed eyes, not alarmed yet, only irritated by an unexpected flaw in a simple performance. Clara whispered, "Do not." Only Nathaniel heard her, or perhaps he felt it more than heard it, the plea of someone who had learned that even help could become another burden placed upon her shoulders. He did not look back. If he looked at her, he feared the cold discipline holding him together might crack before its hour. Mrs. Crane lifted the pendant higher. "Thomas Gray, return to your place." "I am in my place." The words were quiet, yet they traveled across the ballroom as if the marble itself had carried them. A few guests exchanged amused glances. One older gentleman gave a small laugh into his glove. The servant has opinions. Nathaniel turned his eyes toward him, and the laugh ended unfinished. There were habits no wool coat could hide. Authority lived not in velvet, but in the stillness of a man who had never needed to ask twice. Mrs. Crane recovered first. This girl has been found with stolen property concealed within her station. The household will deal with her according to order. No, Nathaniel said. It will not. Abigail gave a delicate gasp, now more insulted than injured. And who are you to forbid it? Someone who saw Miss Bennet nowhere near that drawer. Vincent stepped away from the fireplace. Careful, fellow. You may think yourself gallant, but gallantry sits poorly on a servant accused of lying for a pretty maid. The room stirred at that, hungry again for humiliation dressed as wit. Nathaniel felt Clara stiffen behind him, but she did not step away. He answered Vincent without raising his voice. If beauty made truth inconvenient, my lord, then every portrait in this room would be guilty of deception. A small shock passed through the guests. Servants did not speak like that. New men did not answer gentlemen as equals. Vincent's eyes sharpened. Your name. You have heard it. Then hear mine. I am Lord Vincent Blackwell, cousin to the Duke of Whitmore, and in his absence this household respects my judgment. Nathaniel looked at him fully. That has been its misfortune. The words struck the room harder than any shout. Mrs. Crane's face lost color beneath its practiced severity. Vincent took one measured step forward, his smile thinning. You forget yourself. No, Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his rough coat. I did that years ago. Clara drew in a small breath behind him. The sound passed through him like a hand laid upon a wound. Slowly, so every eye could follow, Nathaniel withdrew the linen-wrapped object he had carried through pantry smoke, servant corridors, and the cold silence of the east wing. He unfolded the handkerchief. Blackstone caught the chandelier light. Gold flashed beneath it. The signet ring of House Whitmore lay in his palm, dark as a sealed verdict. A murmur rose, broke, and died. Mrs. Crane stepped back as if the floor had shifted beneath her. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. Vincent did not move at all, and that stillness was the first honest thing his face had shown. Nathaniel slid the ring onto his finger. It fit as it always had, with the weight of blood, duty, and every neglected soul beneath his roof. Then he removed the servant's cap and let it fall to the marble. Bow lower, he said, not loudly, not cruelly, but with a coldness no fire in the ballroom could soften. You are standing before your duke. What followed was not noise, but collapse. Curtsies broke crookedly. Men who had smirked moments before bent their heads with sudden devotion. Servants froze between terror and awe. The musicians lowered their instruments. Even the chandelier seemed to hold its flame more carefully. Clara remained behind him, still and pale, the only person in the room who did not immediately kneel or bow because astonishment had rooted her to the marble. Nathaniel turned then, just enough to see her. The look in her eyes wounded him more than any accusation could have. Not joy, not relief. Betrayal, perhaps. Confusion. The quiet pain of realizing that the one person who had seemed powerless beside her had been powerful enough to end her suffering from the beginning. He accepted that wound. He had earned it. Miss Bennet, he said, and her name, spoken by the Duke rather than Thomas Gray, changed shape in the air. You are not accused in this house. You are under my protection. Mrs. Crane found her voice in fragments. Your Grace, there has been a misunderstanding. We acted only to preserve the honor of the household. Nathaniel turned back to her. The honor of this household was not endangered by a hungry girl with an empty apron. His gaze moved to the pendant in her hand. It was endangered by those who believed hunger would make her easy to condemn. Abigail lowered her eyes. Vincent's jaw tightened. He was calculating still. Nathaniel saw it. The deeper truth remained hidden beneath floorboards, sealing wax, and 5 years of poisoned memory. He could expose the stage theft now, but not yet Eleanor's stolen voice. Not yet the full architecture of betrayal. So he did what power rarely did well. He waited. No servant is to touch Miss Bennet's room, he said. No drawer, trunk, pocket, or scrap of linen belonging to her will be searched without my presence. Mrs. Crane, You will surrender your keys to the old steward until I call for them." Mrs. Crane's mouth opened, but no sound came. The keys at her waist seemed suddenly loud as she unfastened them. Nathaniel looked at Vincent. "And you, cousin, will remain at Whitmore Hall tonight." Vincent smiled faintly, but his eyes had cooled. "Of course, your grace." "Good." Nathaniel's hand closed once at his side, not in rage, but in restraint. "I have found that men who are innocent sleep well under the same roof as the truth." Behind him, Clara finally moved. Not away, not toward him, only enough to lift her chin before the room that had tried to teach her shame. The diamonds in Mrs. Crane's hand looked small now, almost foolish, beside the dignity of the girl they had failed to break. And in that room of silk, frost, candlelight, and kneeling lies, Nathaniel understood that revealing himself had not ended the danger. It had only taught the guilty that the dead duke they had imagined in Boston had returned alive, and that he had come home through the servants' door carrying silence like a blade still sheathed. The ballroom remained bowed around Nathaniel like a field of winter grass after frost, but he did not mistake silence for obedience. Silence had ruled Whitmore Hall too long already. He dismissed the musicians first, then the guests, not with anger, but with a courtesy so cold that no one dared linger to test it. Carriages were called. Cloaks were gathered. Miss Abigail Monroe departed with her mother before 9, her recovered pendant fastened once more at her throat, though its sparkle now looked less like elegance than accusation. Mrs. Crane was escorted to the housekeeper's office by old Mr. Bellamy, the steward whose loyalty Nathaniel should have trusted years before. Vincent remained by the fireplace, smiling faintly as if the evening had been an inconvenience and not the beginning of his ruin. Clara stood near the sideboard, the gray of her servant's dress almost colorless beneath the chandelier, her hands folded so tightly that Nathaniel knew she was holding herself together by discipline alone. He wished to speak to her, to explain the false name, the hidden ring, the many failures that had brought him home too late. But apology was a door that could not be opened while enemies still walked freely behind him. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying only far enough for her to hear. "The East Wing, if you please." Her eyes lifted to his. For one instant, he saw Thomas Gray die in them. What remained was the Duke, and between them stood every stair, wall, and law that had ever taught a servant girl not to trust a nobleman's kindness. Still, she nodded. They walked without an escort. Behind them, the ballroom candles were being extinguished one by one, and with each flame lost, the house seemed to return to its truer shape: stone, draught, memory, and the long ache of things unsaid. Nathaniel carried a single lamp. Clara walked beside him, not behind, because he slowed his step until the choice became natural. Neither spoke until they reached the corridor where he had first found her kneeling before Eleanor's locked chamber. The black ribbon still tied the bell pull. The marbles still held the faint scent of soap and cold water. Nathaniel removed the keys from his pocket, the keys Mrs. Crane had surrendered with fingers pale from humiliation. At the chamber door, his hand paused. 5 years ago, he had locked this room as if grief could be contained by brass. 5 years ago, he had believed a letter laid upon his desk, bearing Eleanor's hand, confessing betrayal, naming Vincent as innocent witness. 5 years ago, he had chosen pride because sorrow had made it easier than doubt. "Your Grace," Clara said softly. It was the first time she had called him that since the revelation, and the distance in it struck deeper than blame. "You do not have to enter if it is too much." Nathaniel looked at her then. She, who had been accused before strangers, who had been starved of warmth and dignity, was offering mercy to the man who owned the roof beneath which it happened. "That is precisely why I must," he said. The key turned. The door opened with a low breath of stale air, lavender long faded, paper, dust, and the ghost of extinguished fires. The room had not been ruined. That was its cruelty. Eleanor's writing desk stood near the window. A blue shawl lay over the chair. Books rested in a small tower beside the bed, as if she might return to finish the top one before dawn. Clara did not step in until Nathaniel did. The lamp shook once in his hand, only once, but she saw it. She did not pretend otherwise. She only moved to the hearth and set the flame where it could fill the room without wounding him too brightly. "The panel is there," she whispered, pointing toward the narrow strip of carved wood beneath the window seat. I found the handkerchief when Mrs. Crane sent me to dust outside the door last month. The lock had not caught properly. I should have reported it. No, Nathaniel said. You preserved what others meant to erase. Clara knelt before the panel, then stopped. May I? He almost answered as a duke grants permission. Instead, he understood that this was not his authority alone. It was Eleanor's last room, Clara's guarded truth, and a dead woman's chance to be heard. Please, he said. Clara pressed the carved rose at the corner. The panel loosened with a soft click. Behind it lay a shallow space holding only dust, a sliver of wax, and a folded paper sealed in blue. Nathaniel did not move. The seal was not broken. The handwriting on the front was Eleanor's, unmistakable in its elegant restraint. To my husband, when anger has exhausted him enough to listen. The words blurred, though no tear fell. Clara rose and stepped back, giving him the room a soul needs when it is about to meet the truth it once refused. Nathaniel broke the seal. The letter was not long. Eleanor had written that she had discovered Vincent's forged accounts, that Mrs. Crane had carried messages for him, that the first letter accusing her of betrayal was false. She had written that she feared Nathaniel's grief and pride would be used against him because he trusted pain more readily than tenderness. She had written that if she could not defend herself, he must look beneath the winter roses in the east room floor. There, she had hidden the duplicate ledgers and Vincent's own note arranging the deception. Nathaniel read to the end without speaking. His face did not change, but Clara saw his hand tremble where it held the paper. The great, cold Duke of Whitmore stood in the room of his dead wife and learned that he had mourned her through a lie. Clara did not touch him. She did not offer easy comfort. She only moved the lamp closer, just as she had moved the candle in the pantry, so he would not have to stand in darkness while breaking. After a long silence, Nathaniel knelt by the floorboards beneath the carved winter roses. With Clara's help, he lifted the loose plank. Inside lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth, ledgers, notes, a second seal, and a letter in Vincent's hand ordering Mrs. Crane to ensure that no servant loyal to Eleanor remained at Whitmore Hall. The truth had not been dead. It had been waiting beneath his feet. Nathaniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the coldness there had changed. It was no longer emptiness. It was judgment. Tomorrow, he said, voice low and steady, my cousin will answer for every year he stole from her name. Clara looked at the papers, then at the blue handkerchief she had placed on the desk. And her grace. Nathaniel folded Eleanor's letter with both hands, as if gentleness had returned to him through pain. Her grace, he said, will be remembered rightly before this house sleeps again. Outside the window, the mist had lifted from the Maryland hills, and moonlight touched the wet glass like a pale hand. In that quiet room, surrounded by dust, lavender, and the long-delayed mercy of truth, Clara Bennett stood beside the Duke she no longer knew how to trust, while he stood beside the girl who had defended his dead when he had failed to defend even his own heart. Morning came to Whitmore Hall, without music. The frost on the carriage road shone pale beneath a hard blue sky, and every window of the great house reflected the light, as if the stones themselves had been forced to wake and look upon what they had hidden. Nathaniel did not sleep. Neither did Clara. By 7 o'clock, old Mr. Bellamy had carried summons through the corridors, and by 8, every servant, guest who had remained overnight, steward, clerk, and member of the household stood in the main hall beneath the black-framed portrait of Eleanor Whitmore. Lord Vincent arrived last, dressed with his usual care, his face composed in the manner of men who believe dignity can survive exposure if held stiffly enough. Mrs. Crane stood near the staircase without her keys, and that absence made her look smaller than any accusation could. Clara remained at the edge of the servants' line in her gray dress, the blue handkerchief folded in both hands, her eyes lowered but not defeated. Nathaniel stood before them in black, the signet ring uncovered, Eleanor's letter resting on the table beside the packet of ledgers. He did not thunder. Thunder was for storms and frightened men. He spoke with the quiet steadiness of a door closing forever. For 5 years, this house has repeated a lie about its duchess. The hall did not breathe. It has called silence loyalty. It has called cruelty order. It has permitted the name of Eleanor Whitmore to be handled by those unworthy even to dust her portrait. Vincent gave a faint, polished laugh. Cousin, grief often makes patterns where there are none. Nathaniel looked at him, and the laugh vanished into the marble. Grief did many things to me, Vincent. It made me proud. It made me absent. It made me easier for a coward to deceive. But it did not write these ledgers in your hand. He opened the packet. Page by page, note by note, the truth entered the hall without drama because truth needed no ornament. Vincent had forged accounts to drain tenant rents into hidden investments. Mrs. Crane had dismissed servants who questioned missing funds. Letters had been copied, seals misused, rumors planted, and Eleanor's final warning concealed beneath the winter roses in her own chamber. No one interrupted after that. Even Abigail Monroe, standing beside her pale mother near the door, looked as if every diamond she owned had become too heavy to wear. When Nathaniel read Eleanor's line aloud, saying she feared her husband would trust pain more readily than tenderness, his voice did not break, but his hand rested for one moment on the table as though the wood alone held him upright. Clara saw it. She saw the Duke, not the disguise, not the title, not the cold statue society had made of him, but the wounded man beneath all that black cloth and old command. When the reading ended, Nathaniel folded the letter with reverence. Lord Vincent Blackwell will leave Whitmore Hall today under guard of my steward and my legal counsel. His claims to family trust and estate authority are revoked. Mrs. Crane will answer for her part before the proper authorities. Until then, she will not command a single soul beneath this roof. No one cheered. Justice in that hall arrived like snow, silent and complete. Mrs. Crane lowered her head. Vincent's mouth tightened, but the room had already withdrawn from him. That was the final punishment of polished men, to discover that admiration had only ever been rented. Then Nathaniel turned toward Clara. The movement changed the hall more deeply than any sentence against the guilty. Servants shifted. Guests looked away, then back again. Clara lifted her eyes and held the handkerchief closer, as if she expected another task, another burden, another order wrapped in gratitude. Instead, Nathaniel stepped down from the table and stopped several feet before her, leaving space enough for dignity to stand between them. "Miss Clara Bennet," he said, and every voice in the hall seemed to disappear inside her name. "This house failed you." Her lips parted, but no words came. "Its master failed you first, because a roof bears the character of the man who owns it, whether he is present or not. You were given cold rooms, poor meals, suspicion, and insult. In return, you gave this house what no one else did. You gave it truth." Clara's eyes shone, but she did not cry, not because she felt little, but because she had spent too many years learning that tears were safest when left unseen. Nathaniel lowered his head to her, not as a gesture of romance, not as performance, but as one soul acknowledging another before witnesses who had once mistaken rank for worth. A murmur passed through the servants. Some looked stunned. Some looked moved. Mr. Bellamy removed his spectacles and wiped them slowly. Nathaniel turned to the entire hall. "Let it be recorded by every person present. Miss Bennet did not serve Whitmore Hall. She saved it." The words settled into the beams, the stairwell, the marble, the locked and unlocked rooms. Clara looked toward Eleanor's portrait, and for the first time, the painted face above the hall did not seem lonely. Later, when the guilty had been led away, when Abigail had departed in silence, when Mrs. Crane's office stood open and emptied of its keys, Clara went to the servants' quarters to pack her small trunk. She believed gratitude was safer from a distance. She believed a duke's protection could not become a life for a woman like her. At dusk, Nathaniel found her near the back door where he himself had entered the night before as Thomas Gray. Snow had begun to fall, light and slow, softening the world beyond the steps. "Are you leaving without supper?" he asked. Clara turned, her trunk at her feet. "I thought it best, Your Grace." The title placed a wall between them. He felt it and accepted the pain of it. "I cannot ask you to trust me because I revealed the truth. I wore a lie to do it. You had reason. So does every person who lies well." She looked at him then, and something in her softened, not forgiveness entire, but the first thaw at the edge of it. Nathaniel opened the door beside the corridor, not the servants' exit, but the library entrance, long reserved for the Whitmore family alone. Firelight glowed within. On the desk lay Eleanor's restored letter, Clara's blue handkerchief, and a fresh place set with tea, bread, and warm soup. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not as a servant, not as a debt. Stay as the first honest soul this house has known in years. And if one day you choose to go, you will leave by the front door, with my carriage, my protection, and my gratitude following you farther than any winter road." Clara looked past him into the library, where the fire did not ask whether she had earned its warmth. Snow touched the threshold behind her. Candlelight touched the room before her. At last, she lifted her trunk, not to carry it away, but to set it down. Nathaniel did not smile as men smile when they believe they have won something. He only breathed, as if air had returned to a place inside him he had forgotten was meant to live. And in Whitmore Hall, where lies had once worn silk and silence had once ruled like law, a dead woman's name was spoken with honor again. A poor girl was no longer invisible, and a cold heart learned that some truths do not destroy a house. They open its windows and teach it how to breathe.